meet with me. And as God's providence would have it, he introduced me to an attorney who then introduced me to what he called the best medical malpractice attorney in Wisconsin. And what he told me really got me to stop pursuing a lawsuit. And he said specifically, even in slam dunk cases like this appears to be, you only have a 1 in 10 chance of winning. And he was being gracious with the 1 in 10 chance. But he gave me an example. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, I had a case where the doctor sewed up a sponge inside of the patient and we lost. I said, well, how is that possible? He said, I brought in an expert to testify, and they brought in 10. And we saw that in Grace's trial, too. We had 2 experts. They brought in 6 experts. So what happens is, in a trial, they can testify to what's called standards of care. And I'll get into that in a moment. But, ultimately, I dug into the state statutes quite a bit then after the conversation with him before we decided to not pursue a lawsuit. And I found a couple of things that were very interesting. One is Wisconsin has a $750,000 cap on medical malpractice cases. It costs roughly $1.1 million to file this case.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, why would you spend $1.1 million to get $750,000 back? And then because Grace was a legal adult, usually where the money is at in a case like this is for loss of companionship. And a legal adult has no loss of companionship by state statute if they are not married and do not have children. So the loss of companionship that Jessica, Grace's sister, Cindy, and I have, it's worth nothing in the state of Wisconsin. And then last, the insurance companies are required, the hospital and the doctors are required to have medical malpractice insurance. So all of their costs for the trial and the preparation for the trial are all paid by insurance versus our costs are out of pocket. So that made it so that we were not going to ever file a lawsuit, but God had other plans, and he opened up the door, and praise God, we were able to walk through it, Jim.
And again, we'll get into the details of it, but Scott, I do want to point back as well from the very outset. You chose Genesis 50, verse 20 as your theme verse, of which is stated of Joseph. He said, "But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass that it is this day, to save much people alive." That verse became real to you. It was more than a cliche. That you felt that verse very intently.
Oh boy, did we ever! And we already won. I mean, we know we won because of our relationship with our Lord and Savior. But as it applies to the trial, one of the things that we realized going in is that if we could have this trial live streamed, it would be an absolute miracle. Mm-hmm. And unbelievably, the trial was live streamed. The entire trial, the New American was able to record and live stream it through Children's Health Defense. So the entire trial is on YouTube now. So it's a permanent record that anybody can see. And boy, did they see a lot. They saw things that should scare them. And I'm sure you'll have questions regarding that, so I won't go into those now. But that was what people saw, and it really should scare them to death.
And you also walked in this trial, Scott, that, as you suspected, the defense really desired to paint you, your wife Cindy, as really being crazed conspiracy theorists, and that's really was a tactic that they used.
That was a surprising tactic. Not that they used it, but that's the only thing that I would be critical of the judge on. In the pretrial hearing, which was the last time we talked, was on May 19th and 20th. And during one of the things that gets handled during the pretrial hearing is a thing called motions in limine. And that's where both sides make their motions for the judge to restrict the type of evidence that comes in. So an example of a motion in limine would be this $750,000 cap. Both sides agreed that that should not come into the trial, so it didn't influence the jury. Well, the judge allowed, we filed motions in limine so that everything that I have studied and researched intently since October 13th of 2021 would not come in the trial. Why? Because it's not related to how Grace died. Mm-hmm. Surprisingly, the judge ruled against us, and so the defense was able to bring that in, and it certainly influenced the jury, even though I was given a chance to explain. And what was interesting, Jim, some of the details of the trial, if people were watching the details, they would see when I would give an explanation and I would go through and say, well, this came out of the New England Journal of Medicine, or this came out of the American Journal of Genetic Medicine, the defense would object because I was not an expert, so I can't quote journals. And, the defense knew I was well-researched, but every time it came to a point where I could explain myself, there was an objection, and those objections were sustained.
My friends, we're going to take a quick break. Scott Scherer is with us here today, and we're talking about the trial. The verdict just issued this past Thursday, but we're walking through that trial, and we'll get further into it about standards of care and other things that came out through the trial itself. Stay with us. We'll be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY American Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, popular creation speaker and author with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, this might seem simple, but where did music come from?
Chris, music is an integral part of being in the image of God. The early chapters of Genesis reveal that just within a few generations of creation, men were constructing musical instruments, both wind instruments and string instruments. Soon we see that even this was perverted. Lamech, one of the patriarchs, even sang a song boasting of his adventures and murderous prowess. Musical instruments have been found from soon after the flood. Even Neanderthal fossils are found in conjunction with musical instruments. You see, Chris, the evidence that we find supports the biblical truth of creation. Even music started back in Genesis.
For more information on the foundational principles set forth in Genesis, simply visit us on the web at www.icr.org. That's www.icr.org.
Yes, friends, for the last 3.5 years, we have brought to you here on Crosstalk the story of Grace Scherer, and certainly our Father Scott has been with us here on several occasions, and talked about the lawsuit coming up, that lawsuit now behind us in a rear-view mirror, Scherer versus Ascension Health. But is it really in a rear-view mirror as a nation, as we take a look where we're heading in this matter of health care and our legal system as well? Scott is with us here today, and we will talk about standards of care here, but I just also want to point out that as you've been on this program, Scott, and you testified, you told us how you were at Grace's side. You saw it. You fought on her behalf. You were asked about what medications they're putting into her. You were monitoring her. You were well researched on this. When you were taken out of the hospital and ushered out by security there, your daughter Jessica was there for a time, and even she went away for just a day here to go grab a shower and get back up to the hospital. But despite all this advocacy you did for your daughter, yet it was you that were being framed as being a delinquent parent.
Yeah, interestingly, one of the motions that ended up being eliminated by the judge is so when the jury goes back to deliberate, they have what's called a special verdict form, which is all the questions they have to answer yes or no. And on the draft that was worked out the day before the trial, or day before the deliberation, which was last week Thursday. So Wednesday was the first day the judge took off me being on the special verdict form. So the defense wanted the liability to be assigned to me as one of the people liable for Grace's death. Right. And praise God the judge took that off, but it ultimately didn't matter in the end. But, you're right. I mean, the advocates, I have a different perspective of advocacy today than I did when I was in the hospital. In fact, if we could replay it, first I would not take Grace to the hospital based on what we know today, but more importantly, if I would have had to take Grace to the hospital, what I know today as an advocate today, she would be alive today. And that's why I keep speaking out, Jim. I don't want anybody, including the defendants in the case, to lose their best buddy. And, I had to lose my best buddy to wake up, and I hope nobody else has to do that. And we'll keep speaking out because that's now our mission.
So let's talk about the standards of care and how that came up through the trial itself.
Well, you and I have talked about standards of care before, but I want to go through a different type. So the standards of care you and I have talked about before are like relative to cancer, where if a doctor doesn't recommend chemo, he can lose his life because chemo, or lose his license because the chemo is a standard of care that he has to recommend. And by recommending that standard of care, he's immune from liability when the person dies of the chemo treatment. Well, the standard of care that came up in the trial is the subjective standard of care. And that's why there's experts. So their experts said that the doctors and nurses did everything perfect. In fact, what the conclusion was is the defense, through their experts, said that by being in a hospital, you are giving implied consent. And the drugs that euthanized Grace were normal in an ICU, so no informed consent is necessary. Remember, this is an opinion. It's a subjective opinion. And I'm going to keep going. Furthermore, they said doctors informing the family is not even necessary for the two prior overdoses. Grace had a third overdose. That's the one that killed her. The prior two overdoses, they had reversed. And that third overdose, as you know, killed Grace, the combination of Precedex, lorazepam, and morphine. They also said, and this one is really the nail in the coffin, they said that a doctor can unilaterally place a DNR on a patient without consent, without a witness, without a signature, and without a DNR bracelet. The jury decided in favor of the defense, and that should scare people because now that becomes the law. Once the jury decides that, it becomes the law. Not worldwide, but certainly it becomes a circuit court decision, which, unfortunately, precedent becomes the law. So that this is what people should know. They're not going to get consent. Informed consent is dead, and a doctor can do a unilateral DNR anytime he wants. And this is a major development. The case showed, we had our experts, of course, disagreed with this. Common sense disagrees with it, but it doesn't matter. We even brought in, Jim, because we knew the judge was leaning toward this idea of implied consent. On the last day that I testified, we showed the general consent document that the hospital put in the medical records, and it's appalling. They showed a record, or they had a record in the medical records that said at 2:27 in the afternoon on October 6th, Grace and I, by the way, got into the emergency room about 2:15 in the afternoon on October 6th, and at 2:27, they put in the medical records that Grace, my 19-year-old daughter with Down syndrome, orally approved the general consent document. I mean, think that through. Yeah. How would they have done that? That means I wouldn't have been in the room with Grace. It's a complete lie. It's hard for me to grasp when we showed it, but still, that was not enough for the jury to decide in our favor.
And that's what's so outrageous by this, and I hope people's ears are perked up to what you're saying, Scott, that it is just implied consent. If you're there for treatment, in essence, we can do anything we want to you as a patient without your consent.
It's really insane. I mean, I was shocked. When I've had multiple people reach out to me, of course, after the trial that have watched the entire trial, and they were in complete shock. But I wasn't in shock because I looked at it. Only one juror was in our favor. The rules in Wisconsin say you have to have 10 of 12, so they had to have 10 of 12 to win, or we had to have 10 of 12. Well, they only deliberated for 90 minutes. So that means you can predict what happened. The four-person took a quick survey. What are we all thinking? And it must have been close to 11-1 right away. Well, if you look at 11-1, what does that mean? Well, that means 8%. One person out of 12 is 8%. That 8% represents the percentage of the population that actually gets this. And I think that's pretty accurate. The rest of them, if you assume the average age of the juror was 50 years old, they've had 50 years of programming to trust this satanic medical system, this allopathic conventional medical system, which is not designed to save you. It's designed to ration care to hasten our death. And that's the fact. Praise God, that got brought out in the trial as part of my supposed conspiracy theories, but I was able to prove it, but it's not enough. When you've been programmed for 50 years, that programming takes over.
Believe the people in white coats all the time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Scott, did you not indicate on a previous interview that on the very morning of Grace's death that the doctor, had sought, ventilator permission once again, which you denied, but then he also say that, well, she's been making improvement and that a ventilator may not be necessary?
Well, the ventilator was always framed as a pre-authorization, and so they would frame it that these type of things tend to happen in the middle of the night when you can't get a hold of the family. So it never came to a point where they said Grace needs a ventilator to live. But he had called us the morning of the 13th asking us again for a pre-authorization. We said no. And then he said to us, Grace had such a good day yesterday, we should work on nutrition. We need to get her out of bed so we can get her home in the next several days, get her bowels moving. So we approved a feeding tube during that conversation. Yeah. Well, amazingly, when you look at the timeline of Grace's last day, prior to that conversation, the Precedex, which was, I'm going to go through Precedex here in a minute, it was increased to the maximum dose at 8:40. The call happened at 10:12. So an hour and a half before the call, they'd already maxed out the Precedex. And as far as getting Grace out of bed, they had no intention of getting Grace out of the bed. The doctor acknowledged on the stand and in his progress report for October 13th that Grace was strapped down to the bed in the hour and a half that Jessica was going to take a shower. That's the hour and a half they increased Precedex to the maximum dose, strapped Grace down to the bed, and then made her defecate in the bed. Jim, I want to just share about Precedex momentarily because all drugs have side effects. And, if you gave your son an aspirin and he had a reaction, would you give him another aspirin?
Nope.
If you did, you'd be a fool. But if you gave him a second one and he had a second reaction, would you give it to him a third time? Obviously, anybody listening to this would say, no, of course you wouldn't. Well, Precedex has side effects too, just like aspirin does. And here's the 12 side effects that were in Grace's medical records for Precedex, but they ignored these. Their blinders ignored the side effects. So here, I'm just going to ramble through these. Respiratory depression, hypoxia, agitation, acidosis, hypotension, fever, blood pressure fluctuation, anxiety, delirium, sepsis, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and cardiac arrest. Those 12 side effects are from the Precedex package insert. Grace had all 12, and they ignored them.
And actually, again, the other troubling thing, if everything is implied consent, then why did they even have to seek your permission for a ventilator to put her on if something happened in the middle of the night? I mean, they obviously had to know that their hands are tied from certain things, from doing certain things.
Well, that became part of the COVID narrative because ventilators, so the times that they asked for my permission and gave me quasi-informed consent were with the ventilator and tocilizumab. Mm-hmm. Both of those things were modalities approved as emergency use authorizations by the FDA. And so once something is under an emergency use authorization, you have to get permission. So that's why. The other things that actually killed Grace, the DNR, the med combination, they didn't need to get permission. Yeah. But they had to get permission because the tocilizumab drug and the ventilator were part of the incentivized protocols under emergency use authorization during COVID.
The professional testimony you brought in, they were appalled at what happened to Grace and the process that they went through in order to take her life.
Dr. Burdine was our doctor expert. The man is a true professional. This was the first plaintiff's case he ever did. He's only worked for defendants. He limited his billing. He didn't take a penny personally. 100% of what he billed us for the trial went to his employer, and the days that he would work full days on the trial at $350 an hour, he only billed $350 a day. That's how much he believed in the trial, and his testimony has gone worldwide. And he said that the idea of giving morphine At 8:09, Grace had no blood pressure and no pulse. At 8:15, they gave Grace morphine, and he said giving Grace morphine when she had no pulse and no blood pressure was the worst clinical decision he has ever seen in 46 years of practice.
So how was that countered?
They said that the records weren't the right time, and it really wasn't no blood pressure because the blood pressure cuff was just wasn't reading right, so they had to move it around. At every point, they would have an excuse, which, an excuse for me, because I've studied this, is a lie. They lied, and unbelievably, the jury bought that. And it's really not a surprise when you understand how deep the programming is, but it is a little bit shocking, at least.
Friends, we're going to take a quick break. We'll delve a little bit further into this, as well as what is the takeaway. Where do things go from here? Scott Scherer with us here today on Crosstalk, and you're listening to the VCY American Network. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
The Bible follows the rise and fall of kingdoms and governments, covers millennia of ancient history, and reveals God's plan for humanity through powerful accounts that still speak today. In the hardcover book, Charting the Bible Chronologically, authors Tommy Ice and Ed Heinzen team up to provide readers a panoramic view of the events recorded in Scripture, all laid out in chronological order. This book takes you from the words "in the beginning" all the way to the New Jerusalem. With 40-plus color charts, you will see timelines of biblical history, pre-flood genealogy, Israel, overviews of major empires, the life of Christ, God's judgments, and a master fold-out chart of the entire Bible. It's a vital resource for new believers and Bible scholars alike. Charting the Bible Chronologically. Available for a donation of $30 or more to VCY. Call 1-800-729-9829.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Scott Scherer with us here today. The verdict has been issued in regard to Scherer versus Ascension, and talking through much of the trial and so forth as well. Scott, do you believe that individuals with Down syndrome are targeted individuals?
I don't believe it. I know it. There was a study by the American Journal of Genetic Medicine of 1.7 million patients that were in hospitals during COVID, and 825 hospitals. They did a across-the-board study, and it showed that anybody with Down syndrome had a 630% more likely chance of having an illegal do not resuscitate order on their chart. So I'm positive. We should know this even going in, because those individuals with Down syndrome are murdered in the womb at the rate of 90% in America. So it's no surprise that they're targeted. That is not what we made our case about, because it's a civil case. We tried to really streamline the case relative to the medical facts that were in the records. We had enough to prove our case without zooming out to these bigger, broader issues. But it was clearly that the idea of people who are, quote, non-contributing members of society, end quote, the useless eaters, that was the term from World War II. Our country does not want those useless eaters around, and unfortunately, Grace was labeled as one of those. Grace was not a useless eater. Grace was a gift from God. In fact, in the medical records on page 1065, there's a question, Jim. It says, VIP patient, ? Answer, N. Grace was not a VIP to them.
A very important person. So had Grace been a celebrity, would there be a different outcome today?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't know that for sure, but it makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Those type of things in the records.
Why would they ask such a question? Why would they have such a question if this is a VIP?
I did a Substack on this because I wondered that same thing myself, and it's just they get a different level of treatment. So one of the things that they're concerned about is that the hospital staff will give somebody who is a VIP a different level of treatment. And of course they do, but the reason they supposedly put it in is so that they treat everybody equally, which, I know by the research I did after Obamacare was passed, that Down syndrome patients are looked at as a burden to the family. So the doctors are trained to look through the eyes of the family, that the family believes the person is a burden. Well, that's simply not true. In Grace's case, not only did they list Down syndrome 36 different times in the 22 doctors' reports, but they carry forward errors. The first doctor who saw Grace was Dr. Beck. Actually, he never did see Grace. The first doctor's report was from Dr. Beck, and I never met him till the depositions, yet he claimed he had a bedside discussion with me, and part of that bedside discussion ended up in his report, and it said that Grace had conductive hearing loss. So they thought Grace was deaf, and that got carried through all the way through her records through October 13th in a nurse's note. So you think about how they were treating Grace. I mean, they treated her as deaf and dumb.
Yeah, so how then did Grace give them consent, verbally when they asked her when she was admitted?
Yeah.
There was a battery charge that was thrown out. What's that all about?
In Wisconsin, this is the first battery case since 1973, and we knew that there was a possibility of a battery, and this is a legitimate battery. So a battery occurs whenever something happens that you didn't want, and it's done without consent. And the judge bought that argument. I mean, he went along with our argument all the way back to when we filed the battery charge in July of 23, and the judge kept that alive all the way through. And it made our trial sharper because we had to prove the battery claim right before. So after my testimony on Tuesday, the last day of testimony, that's when the judge threw out the battery claim. And, under those two legal principles that it's something you don't want, well, obviously we didn't want the med combination, but it's also something we didn't consent to. And that's why we brought up the document during my testimony that we did not consent to this. I mean, obviously Grace did not consent orally, but that's when the judge said there's an implied consent. So that's why he threw it out. We think he made a bad decision there. We had the top legal minds in the entire country working on this battery claim. We filed a 17-page brief the night before. We brought in a fifth attorney to argue that brief before the judge threw it out, but he ended up throwing it out. We still believe it creates a roadmap for other people to use because it's now public record. And, there's literally tens of thousands of dollars, probably $100,000 that's in that battery claim that people can use to file other battery claims going forward.
So the jurors received an 18-page packet with instructions. Did you have concerns about the instructions that they were given?
Not really. I mean, that was a process that took almost a full day between the special verdict questions and the instructions. We thought the judge handled that very fairly. Many of the instructions are statutory, so you can't change the wording, but it was a long process. It took almost 2 full days to go through that process to hammer out the instructions and the questions for the jury.
So in less than 2 hours, the jury came back with their decision. What were your emotions as that verdict was given?
That's a great question. I wasn't prepared for that one, Jim. I would say I was stunned, but not shocked. I was stunned to think, wow, we really presented a case that was better. We had better witnesses. We had better experts. All the way around, we had a better case. I was stunned, but I wasn't shocked because I have spent so much time researching. And so it was, as I processed it overnight, then we did a press conference the next morning, and I saw it through the lens. God opened up this door. We obediently walked through it. We left it all on the battlefield. And so that meant that God's ways, which we know are higher than our ways, so he must believe there's a better chance of saving lives by a loss versus a victory, which I understand. I'm not frustrated with it at all that way.
Friends, we're going to ask Scott a couple more questions, but if you'd like to get on board here, get online here with your questions or brief comments. Our number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. That's 800-733-9829. You can go back and watch the entire trial that's going on. Scott mentioned began on YouTube, or go to thenewamerican.com. You'll find it right there on their homepage as of right now. But Scott, tell us your takeaway on this from this trial, and where do you go from here?
My takeaway is I want people to not have to lose their best buddy to wake up. This trial, God has a way of showing people things if they have ears to hear, and this trial showed anybody with ears to hear what is going on. And so our tendency is to put faith in man's systems, the medical industrial complex, the legal industrial complex. The medical industrial complex is not where you get health. The legal industrial complex is not where you get justice. We need to rely on God first, and the traps of those systems, that's the world system, it's Satan's system, and those are traps. So I hope people see that before it's too late. As far as what's next, I had taken about 3 months off of the research that I had been doing, just all trial preparation and then the trial itself. I intend to get back to that. I think we've talked about this before. What God showed me in July of 22 is to not use Grace's story to expose evil. So Ephesians 5:11 says, have nothing to do with the fruitful deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Well, that's not what it really says. If you go back to the Tyndale Bible and the Geneva Bible in the 1500s, you see it says to rebuke evil. Satan has to have the evil exposed in order to resurrect himself as the angel of light. And so whenever evil is exposed, we gravitate towards security and comfort. God tells us that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. I mean, he warns against that. And Satan is waiting to pounce on that as evil is exposed. So I want to rebuke evil and keep on the research that I've been working on toward that end. So I intend to pick that up after a couple weeks of interviews that are going on right now, and that's what I see as next, unless God opens up a different door.
And do you plan any sort of appeal?
No, I don't see an appeal. Again, unless God opens that door, we did what we were called to do. God called us into this Antichrist legal system. We did it. And so I don't see an appeal. I don't see why we would do that unless for some reason he opens that door. But otherwise, we did what we were called to do.
Friends, our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. Your questions or brief comments, your words here for Scott Sherrod today, 800-733-9829. Let's go to Marge in Pennsylvania. Marge, you're on the air.
Hi. First, I'm so sorry that happened. I just wanted to share that the same thing happened to my mother who had Alzheimer's. She was in a hospital for a urinary tract infection, and the staff was having some difficulty keeping her in the bed in the middle of the night. So they gave her 3 different medications. And the one medication that they gave her was called Zyprexa. The drug insert for Zyprexa, there's a warning label that says to never give it to patients that have Alzheimer's or any form of dementia. They also gave it to her 30 minutes after they gave her 2 other narcotics. Wow. My mom lived for about 3 days after, but she was in a state of, she was able to feel pain. She wasn't able to communicate with me, but she wasn't mom anymore. So I did obtain an attorney when I found out about the Zyprexa, and that's a whole other story. That was God led me to look at her medical records, and I saw a drug that I didn't recognize. I sought out a Christian attorney. He took the case. he had another attorney who was a medical malpractice attorney. They both took the case. They said, absolutely, what has happened is awful. Everything's here. Everything lines up. You have a winning case. That went on for a year. They tried to reach out to the hospital, The hospital just never responded. They finally called me back, and they said, because of my mother's age and because she had dementia, that there really wasn't enough financially in it for them.
Yeah.
So they decided to not take the case. So I went and I got myself one of the ambulance chaser attorneys. They also refused to take the case. I let it go. This was in August of 2023. I waited another couple of months, and I went back to the hospital. And I said I wanted to sit down with the staff that was there that night. And they actually granted me an opportunity to sit with the head of...
Marge, I'm sorry, I'm up against a break. I'll be back. Stay on line here with us back in a minute here on Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewtube.com. President Trump used our military to strike the nuclear facilities of Iran in Iran on Saturday evening, as we all now know. Americans are divided as to whether there was a national interest issue there for us to get involved in the Middle East. And now America and the world waits to see if there's going to be a broader Middle Eastern war. Well, let me just put on my Bible prophecy hat. One of the things I am seeing is this: Israel flexing some major muscle with some help from America. But Israel has been pounding Iran all on its own. And this makes me wonder if the reputation for Israel will be that they are a major superpower now in the Middle East and will be seen as such. Thus, any nation that wants to come against them will have to build a coalition to do it. And yet, isn't that what we see in Ezekiel 38 and 39? A coalition of nations. We may not like what we see happening in the Middle East or anywhere in the world. The stage is being set for Bible prophecy to be fulfilled.
You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY American Network. Scott Scherer with us here today with the verdict of Scherer versus Ascension Health. The verdict rendered in favor of the hospital last Thursday. We're on the phone right now with Marge in Pennsylvania. And Marge, just for sake of time, just sum things up here in 30 seconds, and I'm going to have Scott then just respond to you here as well.
Absolutely. So I was granted an opportunity to sit down with the doctor and some of the staff. They assured me that what had happened to my mother was wrong. Of course, nothing was put in writing. They said that they were going to take steps to make sure that it didn't happen again. They were going to train their nurses on how to handle Alzheimer's patients. So that was the outcome. Yeah. And I think that was what God wanted the outcome to be.
Okay. Thank you. And Marge, we're so sorry for what you've experienced and gone through. And Scott responded to this because, she, too, as an advocate, said, I'm going to look at, I don't recognize this drug and saw this never should have been given to her mother.
It's quite a story, Marge. What's interesting about it is that type of story happens about 900,000 times a year in our country, and yet nobody really knows it because they don't get the records. Praise God, you could sit down with the staff and they at least made a commitment to change, because that's really what should happen. I would encourage anybody that is listening, a very simple step you can take to help yourself and protect yourself is to get with a doctor or medical professional who's not in the system, which means they do not take Medicare or Medicaid. On Grace's website, ouramazinggrace.net, we have a link to jointhewedge.com. Twyla Braze started that organization, and that is all medical professionals who are not bought by the Medicare and Medicaid system.
Marge, thank you so much for your call here today. We've got Jewel next in Milwaukee. Jewel, you're on the air.
Okay. Yes, I'm sorry about what happened to this young lady, but I had a similar situation with my own mother years ago already, about 11 years ago. I had taken care of her. I had a caregiver, so I'll try to get this as limited as possible. Took her to the hospital when she was having difficulty breathing. Now, granted, she had emphysema. Ultimately, what they did is, and I'll conclude on this, but what they did is they called. I was there. I stayed with her for 2 weeks solid, hoping to revitalize her, bring her back. They had just changed to the new hospitalist program, which they have in place now. The doctor was totally careless, cold, remote, gone from that facility, I believe, at this point. They told me she had actually died when she was still alive. I had been in the hospital so much I could read the charts. Mm-hmm. I read those machines probably better than the nurses did. Her heart was still beating. It might have been in a slow pace, but they insisted that I take her body and get her out of there because, according to them, she had died. So the only thing I could do is remember the people that had buried my father years ago. I trusted them. These men have passed away now. They weren't in another part of Wisconsin. I called, and these old men came out in a bad snowstorm to retrieve my mother's body because they insisted that they had no place to keep her there. Excuse me, I said, you have a morgue here, don't you?
Tell you what, Jill, I can't. Jill, I'm sorry, I don't have time for the entire story here. Do you have any question for our guest?
Well, I'm just letting you know that our medical profession has failed. Mm-hmm. I don't trust them. I think this is all being driven by money. I don't know who actually is running the system, but we really need to, as Americans, start pulling in the ropes and make these people do what they got. They took their oath for. And you remember, they changed their Hippocratic oath, too, and they knew what they were doing.
Jill, thank you so much. We're down to 3 minutes of the program. We've got other callers lined up. Scott, your response to Jewel.
Jewel, thanks for sharing. You're right. I mean, all of us need to take ownership and share our individual stories with whoever will listen to help save their life.
Yeah, indeed. And speaking out and the system and up against the system, Scott shared that here. And thank you, Jewel. Let's go to David in South Dakota. You're on the air.
Okay, just two quick questions. Wondering if you contacted OMRDD, the DDSO, for people with developmental disabilities and found any support or insight there. And the other thing is you saved my life because I will not utilize a hospital. I'm a senior, and I know if I go in there, they have protocols that are going to do me harm. So thank you, and God bless both of you.
Well, thank you, David. We did contact the Department of Justice and Disability Rights of Wisconsin. Both we found out later as to why they weren't interested is that your disability rights expire upon death. Hard to believe, but it's another piece of the legal industrial complex that is against us.
Yeah, and thank you for the call. And Scott, you're certainly not saying friends never, ever go to a hospital. I mean, there are those that are working medicine for the good of others.
Absolutely. I'm not saying to never go to the hospital, but don't use it as your first line of defense. Use it as your last line of defense, and you've got to have an advocate who is awake to go into the hospital with you. Absolutely, it's no question about it. And it's not a place that has your best interest in mind. You have your best interest in mind, and your advocate needs to be in line with you.
We're going to squeeze one last call in. Frank in Pennsylvania, you're on the air.
Hey, how you doing, Scott? I'm so sorry for your loss. I had a similar situation. My brother died in the hospital, October 2021, also Down syndrome. I took him to the hospital. He wasn't feeling good. We went in, and next thing you know, they kind of pushed us out. And a couple of days later, we're FaceTiming, and he was fine. And then a day or two later, they called us up because nobody really could be in the hospital. And they told us that they're going to have to put him on a ventilator. So, during everything that went on, it made sense. And, he passed away. And I guess life goes on, but it seems like they did the right thing. But here I am listening to your story, and I'm kind of questioning that.
Yeah.
I don't know where to start. I'm going to start by watching your YouTube video.
Yeah.
But I feel like just maybe there was some wrongdoing, but I don't know.
Frank,
my question is, where does one begin?
Okay, thank you, Frank. Where does one begin? Sadly, Scott, we have just 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question, Frank. Where I think everybody would begin is realize that God knew the situation with your brother's death before he was ever born. And we got to start with that reality that God is sovereign, even though his death sounds like it was nefarious, just like Grace's. God is sovereign, and that's where you can start with that fact, and then you can start the healing process.
Yeah, you've certainly watched the videos. Scott, for those who want to get in touch with you, you've got some websites where they can do so?
Yes, ouramazinggrace.net is our main website. In the upper right-hand corner, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and that's where I'm announcing things. And you can get a hold of us through the Contact Us tab of ouramazinggrace.net.
Scott, thanks for being with us today.
God bless you, Jim.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.